Have you ever come across a news article, something like this one? Russia's war on Ukraine has some Christians wondering, is this the end of the world? Or what about this one from almost 35 years ago? The devil in Gorbachev. The article states that a small but vocal group of fundamentalist Christians are prepared to argue that the Soviet General Secretary is the Antichrist and the devil's agent on earth. They don't simply mean that Gorbachev is an evil man or that he represents an evil system. No. They mean that he is the tool of the devil, the Antichrist, Mr. 666 himself. There's something dramatic, something gripping about these headlines. But is this really what the Sign of the Beast is all about? And what about that number 666? Is it like an evil talisman with the sign of the cross being the antidote perhaps? Is it a barcode? How are we to know if our interpretation of Revelation 13 is solid or not? If we start to unpack Revelation using the tools of interpretation available to us, we'll be better equipped to sift out sensational headlines from solid conclusions about the book's message that are underpinned by a thorough analysis of the text. My name is Ashley Roberts. Join me as I take a look at possibly the most famous chapter in Revelation, chapter 13. I'll be looking at the author's use of symbolic language, his use of structure within the text to highlight certain aspects of his message, and we'll also explore how the readers and listeners of the day would have approached the meaning of the number of the beast. If you have been confused by Revelation 13, even to the point where you have given up on a solid understanding of it, then join me on this journey of discovery. There are many tools that can help us in our quest to understand the Bible, and therefore the book of Revelation, better. These include analyzing the text to determine its structure, genre, and the original meaning of words and phrases, looking at the culture and politics of the day to determine what the original hearers would think the book meant, studying the author's references to other parts of the Bible to see what the reference phrases mean in their original context, allowing Scripture to interpret itself. This means we scour the text for clues, some more explicit than others, to try and figure out what the author is telling us about the meaning of the more obscure passages. But it also means allowing the clearer sections of the Bible, for example, the letters and the Gospels, to provide an interpretative framework for looking at the more obscure sections. If our interpretation of Revelation contradicts, for example, a clear passage in a letter written to a church to correct their thinking on a certain issue, then we need to review our interpretation of Revelation in the light of the clearer teaching found in the other section of the Bible. As Revelation is largely apocalyptic in style, I have given this topic its own section in the toolbox. And finally, as this book is highly symbolic, we should also look at the numbers that the author has used and ask ourselves what they signify. In literary analysis, a certain text might be classified as a particular genre based on its style, form, or subject matter. In this video, I'll be looking at the apocalyptic genre in an effort to clarify and decode chapter 13. We are all familiar with the fantasy genre in film and television, and we've heard of Dungeons and Dragons, the fantasy role-playing game, and seen mythological dragons and other creatures represented in statues and architecture. All of these examples incorporate beasts, dragons, angels, and demons. Now imagine a religious and political critique come prophecy, where the characters are equally fantastical, and that is exactly what you have in certain sections of Revelation. Highly symbolic, highly metaphoric passages that need decoding into normal language for the ideas to make sense. The problem is we're not used to reading things in the apocalyptic genre at all. While some of us may be big into the fantasy, sci-fi film genre, this won't help us much in terms of knowing how far to go when decoding Revelation, as it's not fiction, but a symbolic representation of fact. A representation of the real world. We need to train ourselves on other examples of this style of writing so that we are more familiar with what to do with Revelation's beasts, maidens, prostitutes, and dragons when we get to them. As it turns out, there is a very useful example. The book of Esther in the Bible tells the story of a Jewish woman who became queen of Persia and saved her people from destruction. The story begins with Esther being chosen as the new queen after the previous queen is executed. Esther's uncle, Mordecai, advises her not to reveal her Jewish heritage to the king, Xerxes. Meanwhile, Haman, the king's chief advisor, plots to exterminate all the Jews in the empire. However, Mordecai discovers the plot, and Esther reveals her Jewish identity to the king, who then orders Haman to be executed and the Jews to be saved. The book ends with the Jews celebrating their deliverance. Now, in certain canons of scripture, for example in the Orthodox and Catholic traditions, there is a passage in the book of Esther called Mordecai's Dream, usually found in chapter 11, after the Protestant version of the book has ended. The dream is written in an apocalyptic style, but is in fact a synopsis of Esther. As you listen to the story, compare it with the normal synopsis outlined earlier. Behold, noise and confusion, thunders and earthquake, tumult upon the earth. And behold, two great dragons came forward, both ready to fight, and they roared terribly. And at their roaring, every nation prepared for war to fight against the nation of the righteous. And behold, a day of darkness and gloom, tribulation and distress, affliction and great tumult upon the earth. And the whole righteous nation was troubled. They feared the evils that threatened them and were ready to perish. Then they cried to God, and from their cry, as though from a tiny spring, there came a great river. With abundant water, light came, and the sun rose, and the lowly were exalted, and consumed those held in honor. Mordecai saw in this dream what God had determined to do, and after he awoke, he had it on his mind and sought all day to understand it in every detail. Comparing these two versions of the same account gives us insights into how to approach Revelation's apocalyptic sections and work our way back to a more everyday understanding of the passage. We see that the dragons are in fact two people, Haman as representative of the Persians and Mordecai as representative of the Jews, or maybe even Haman and Esther. And there was no noise, no thunder, no earthquake even. These elements were simply setting the scene for the rising tension between Haman and the Jewish people. When the sanctioned civil war, if you like, broke out between the Jews and their enemies, with the Jews subsequently declaring victory, this is described as a tiny spring from which came a great river with abundant water. But really it was the winning of the war being described. This is a very short apocalyptic scene, but as I mentioned before, it's pretty unique in that there is a parallel text written in a very normal narrative style that we can access and compare. If you are interested in the genre, you can explore further. A good place to start is the Book of Enoch, which, although not acknowledged as being part of the canon of Scripture, at least not in the West, is in fact referred to in the New Testament and is definitely worth a read. Let's now turn our attention to chapter 13 of Revelation. We'll start our analysis by reading chapter 13. As an aside, if you're not already doing so, I would highly recommend reading Revelation from cover to cover a few times. You could use an audio Bible for this. As you read or listen, your mind will start to make connections and things will start to become clearer with time. Chapter 13 reads, The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and each head had a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Then I heard a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Let's look at the dragon and the beast in verses 1 to 3 in more detail. We know that the dragon is Satan because we are actually told this in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, which says, "The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient snake called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray." The beast that comes out of the sea seems to be a mashup of multiple animals, and for us to understand this reference, we need help from an Old Testament book, the book of Daniel, another book containing apocalyptic sections. In chapter 7 we read, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, 'In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which stood like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns." In chapter 7, Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts coming up out of the sea, and is told that they represent 4 kingdoms. A beast like a lion with eagle's wings, a beast like a bear, raised up on one side with 3 ribs between its teeth, a beast like a leopard with 4 wings like those of a bird and 4 heads, and finally a 4th beast with large iron teeth and 10 horns. These beasts in Daniel represent earthly kingdoms, with a number of Daniel's beasts having horns representing kings. You can read about this in chapter 7 from verse 15. In Revelation, it's important, therefore, to see this beast not as one kingdom or one superpower, but a mashup of numerous kingdoms, which could either be an amalgamation of nations from one time period, for example, ancient Rome, the Ottoman Empire, or the United Nations even, or a collection of superpowers across time. That is to say, the beast represents the historical empires of the world. Verse 3, highlighted in blue, acts as a bridge between this section and the next. It's a rather cryptic statement. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. In the original Greek, the phrase for seemed to have had a fatal wound, or esphagmenon, as if slain, is precisely the same phrase describing the lamb in chapter 5, verse 6 and verse 12. The lamb that was slain. So here is a component of deception, an indication through the author's exact choice of words that there is a genuine slain lamb and a counterfeit semi-slain beast with an appearance of resurrection. This particular head of the beast could possibly refer to the contemporaneous Roman emperor Nero Caesar, who ruled around the same time Revelation was written and who was known for being a very eccentric and theatrical person. Some believe that he may have staged his own death in order to create a dramatic comeback. There are also indications that Nero may have attempted to commit suicide by stabbing himself in the neck, and he subsequently needed help to complete what he started. In Revelation and Daniel, beasts tend to represent nations, and horns and heads tend to represent individual leaders. This is just a general trend, though, not a hard and fast rule. For now, let's park these ideas and see if the rest of the chapter can throw any light on the matter down the line. Remember that whatever we think the statement means, it must be according to how the original hearers would have understood the passage. What did it mean to them? And it must be an interpretation which aligns with the clearer sections of Scripture. So, let's hold these thoughts for a moment while we look at the rest of the chapter. From verse 4, matching word and phrase pairs are highlighted in red. Indenting each level of the chiasm makes the structure clear. Note how, in this section, the second levels also contain the word authority, in addition to the words worship and beast. The word authority is again found in the apex level of the chiasm. John is pointing out to us the pathway of authority from the dragon to the beast, then over every tribe, people, language, and nation. Knowing as we do that the beasts stand for political entities in apocalyptic literature, we can see straight away from a quick read of this chapter that the beast represents some kind of political amalgamation. Now we need to try and figure out if this mashup is all-inclusive in terms of geography at a particular point in time, or whether it spans the course of history, or whether it's both. There are a couple of clues in the lowest and apex levels of the chiasm, starting at verse 3. If we first look at the lowest level, we see that the whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. And we see from the last line of the chiasm, also on the lowest level, that this is connected to all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Now, as contemporary Christians, we are very familiar with the Lamb label. This idea of Jesus being a lamb is actually taken straight from Revelation 5. More on that in another video. But we know that Jesus was not killed at the creation of the world. Now, if we re-look at the matching level in line 1, we see that the phrase "from the creation of the world" is paired with the phrase "the whole world." By now, you will have realized that this symbolic section of chapter 13 is not emphasizing a geographical group of nations at one point in history, but the entire collection of nations, the whole world, over the course of time, spanning from the creation of the world and lasting for 42 months. So there is an epoch in mind here. We can examine the symbolism of 3.5 years in more depth in another video, but for now it's enough for us to realize that this is definitely not a literal 3.5 years, and this is for two reasons. Firstly, it's mentioned at the center of a highly symbolic passage written in apocalyptic language, and second, the time period needs to encompass many nations and begin from the creation of the world. Now let's look at verses 11 to 18 for a different perspective on the same idea. The passage contains a number of repeated words. If we highlight these and then indent according to the occurrence of these words, a stepped structure emerges. The key words are like signboards, pointing us to the intended focus of each stanza and showing us the progression of the paragraph. So the flow is, the second beast performed great signs, ordering an image of the first beast to be set up, and placing a mark on people, which is the number of the beast's name, also the number of a man's name. Notice the allusion to verse 3 in verses 12 and 14, highlighted in blue again, which reads, "One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed." Notice also that in the context of the rest of Revelation, which is largely chiastic, this passage kind of hangs in mid-air, as the levels don't resolve downwards after the apex, a nod, no doubt, to the unanswered riddle at the end of the section. Riddles are quite common in apocalyptic literature. They are usually surrounded by clues as to their meaning, and they challenge the listener or reader to come up with the answer. The riddle of the number 666 is no exception to this rule. We are challenged to solve the riddle by finding clues in the passage. We already have one in verse 3, the bridging verse that comes at the end of the first chiasm. The idea of being wounded and healed comes up again twice in this section, so it is important to bookmark this idea. In a very readable, well-referenced and fascinating faculty publication from the Luther Seminary in Minnesota entitled "The Number of the Beast in Revelation 13 in Light of Papyri, Graffiti and Inscriptions," Professor Craig Koester says, "Much of what is said about the beast can be applied to various Roman emperors, who were said to wield authority over every people and nation. But some aspects are especially reminiscent of Nero. The beast is said to have been slain with a sword and yet to be alive. The interpreters often note that Nero was said to have committed suicide by placing a dagger to his throat, yet rumors arose that he was still alive and would return. Of all the first century emperors, Nero was remembered for his brutal persecution of Christians. He was called a beast, and some thought he would come back as an embodiment of Satan. According to Revelation 17 verse 9, the beast's 7 heads represented the 7 hills on which the city that rules the world is built, an allusion to Rome. Yet the beast also burns that city with fire, a charge that uniquely was leveled against Nero, who was implicated in a fire that destroyed much of Rome. The literary description of the beast gives readers the clues needed to theorize that its name has some connection to Nero. When the writer challenges them to calculate the number of the beast's name, readers must look for some way of spelling Nero's name that will have the letters needed to yield the correct numerical total. The most natural move would be to use Greek letters, but in Greek the name Nero has a numerical value of 1005. When Nero Caesar is written in Hebrew letters, however, it does equal the requisite 666, or 666. This approach has many proponents. Some find added support for the Nero Caesar hypothesis in that, in Latin, the name is written Nero rather than Neron, as in Greek, so that it lacks the final N. In Hebrew, the transliteration of N has the value of 50, and when that is subtracted from 666, it yields 616. So forms of Nero Caesar actually work for both 666 and 616, which is found in some manuscripts. The point is that readers must form a hypothesis about the name from the literary context, and the riddle is a challenge to see if the readers can find a name with a numerical total that fits the context. By weaving traits of Nero into the portrayal of the beast, the writer of Revelation asserts that in the violent practices of Nero, the Roman Empire shows its true character. Nero's reign ended in 68 AD, and Revelation was probably composed some years later, perhaps 80 to 100 AD. Recent studies of Revelation have emphasized that the author wrote in a context where many of his readers regarded Roman rule as benign. The messages to the churches refer to some who were prospering in the Roman era economy and others who were ready to accommodate Roman religious practices. To challenge the reader's complacency, the writer draws on traditions about Nero's brutality in order to show that the imperial, political, and economic order is not benign but threatening. Weaving the memory of Nero into the portrayal of the beast by means of a riddle is part of the writer's challenge to the readers. It is notable that one work of graffiti art at Smyrna noted that two different words had equal numerical value, in that case, Kyrios, meaning Lord or Master, and Piestes, meaning faith. Interpreters have noted that this technique also works in Revelation. If the Greek word for beast, therion, is transliterated into Hebrew letters, tron, its value is 666. Revelation explains that this number corresponds to a man's name. Since the Hebrew forms of beast and Nero Caesar both equal 666, the calculation might underscore that the two are the same. The beast is a Nero-like figure. After expounding on other options, for example seeing 666 as falling short of the perfect 777, Koester has this to say: the more plausible approach is based on the idea that the verb calculate, which is psephizo, was commonly used for adding up the numerical values of letters and words as noted above. Note that the most important factor is that the context must provide enough information for the readers to guess the answer, and only then find ways for the number to equal that answer. It is the literary context that makes the connection with Nero's name plausible. The challenge is finding a specific way to link his name to the number. Here are the key concepts from chapter 13 with a few pointers from chapter 12. Satan is symbolized by the dragon. In the symbolic story from chapter 12, he was thrown out of heaven and cast down to earth. We know this happened a long time ago because at the time of writing, the dragon is decoded as that ancient serpent or Satan. He gives his authority to the beast, which symbolizes the nations, the superpowers, from the time he was cast out up to the present day at the time Revelation was written, the 1st century AD. The beginning of history up until the 1st century AD is represented by the symbolic number of 42 months, or 3.5 years. 3.5 is, of course, half of 7. We will talk more extensively about this in another video. The current superpower of the day, Rome, in many ways embodies the multinational nature of the beast, as Rome assimilated many nations into its vast dominion. With its forced emperor worship and persecution of those who refused, Rome in many ways represented a culmination of the satanic power and authority that had been granted, courtesy of the dragon, to Rome and all the nations that came before. The aim of the passage is to make us see that the beast from the sea is all about political authority and persecution. It spans multiple epochs of history, culminates in the Roman superpower, and is part of a story that has been developing since the beginning of the world.
Analyzing Revelation can sometimes feel like you've fallen down a bit of a rabbit hole, and at the bottom you're going to find little snippets of historical information and some things that don't seem to fit and that clutter the narrative. Now this is because, and I know this from personal experience, because you are unfamiliar with the text. But as you grow in your knowledge, in your understanding, as you read the book itself, you will start to make connections between sections, and then the clutter can inform your ideas and add nuance and meaning to your main points that you have brought out already.
I hope you found this video useful and informative. Looking at the apocalyptic elements, textual patterns, and contemporary meaning in Revelation is like using tools to better understand the book. There are a number of other tools available to us to see the author's message, which are explored in other videos. Thanks for watching, and ciao for now.